The morning mist lay thin and silver over Arlington, and Staff Sergeant Ray Kim moved through it with ceremonial precision, his boots clicking in perfect rhythm across stone, 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat, while white marble and long ranks of headstones held the gathered crowd in a silence that felt less like quiet and more like prayer. Before we dive into this story, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe that values like honor, courage, and sacrifice still matter, join us in keeping their legacy alive. Minutes earlier, he stood 6'2" in the uniform of the Old Guard, and every element of that uniform carried its own discipline. His kepi sat at an exact angle. His brass caught pale sun and gave it back without glare. His white gloves remained pristine despite the damp air. The dark wool lay across his shoulders with lines so exact they looked measured by instrument, each crease sharp enough to cut glass. The rifle at his shoulder never drifted. To people watching for the first time, he looked carved from polished granite, a figure of stillness placed among monuments of permanence. To those who had served, the details read differently. They understood that stillness was not the absence of effort. It was effort refined to its purest form, held without complaint, in service of men whose names were unknown and whose sacrifice was absolute. The cemetery carried its own layered music that morning. Beyond the ceremonial cadence of Ray's steps came the soft, electric hum of shuttle trams at the loop below, idling in sequence. Farther off, muted by distance and weather, a rifle volley from another honors detail cracked and rolled, then faded into the hills. A flag snapped once in a brief crosswind and settled. Gravel shifted under respectful shoes. A stroller wheel clicked over expansion joints in the walkway. Even those small noises seemed to lower themselves as they entered that ground. Arlington had a way of taking the rough edges off human motion. Voices that arrived casual left as whispers. Tourists who had spent the morning narrating every photograph found themselves talking less, listening more. Ray's assignment at that hour was temporary ceremonial transit security near the shuttle lane after the changing ceremony. A narrow stretch where sacred ground met ordinary movement, and where one lapse, one careless step, could force consequence into a place that demanded composure. He was away from the mat, but not away from duty, and in his mind there was no true division between zones. Marble was marble. Names carved in white stone were still names carried by families in living rooms and kitchen drawers and folded flags on mantels. At Arlington, protocol and memory did not operate as separate systems. They moved together, and men like Ray were expected to hold both. A father in a denim jacket eased a stroller to a stop and lifted his son so the child could see over the barrier line. Two high school boys with team hoodies lowered their phones without being asked and tucked them into their pockets. An elderly Marine in a Purple Heart cap stood with one hand pressed against his cane and the other flat against his chest, chin raised, jaw set, eyes wet but steady. Beside him, a veteran nurse in a dark green coat and old service pin watched Ray's cadence with professional stillness, as if she could read pulse and strain even across distance. A middle-aged couple from the Midwest, matching rain shells zipped to their throats, stopped talking and simply stood together with linked hands. A pair of college students who had been comparing coffee spots fell quiet mid-sentence. Arlington turned spectators into witnesses and witness into responsibility. Near the shuttle approach waited Emma Cole, 9 years old, seated in a wheelchair with a small navy blanket folded across her knees and a gold star pin on her coat collar. Her hair was braided tight by hands that had learned efficiency under pressure. Her mother stood behind her with both hands on the handles and the posture of someone who had slept lightly for years, protective without drama. Emma's eyes tracked Ray's movement with total concentration, not the distracted gaze of a child skimming a performance, but the attentive gaze of someone who understood the shape of loss even at 9. Her father had been an Army medic. She had come to Arlington before, and each time she watched the guards with a seriousness that made adults step back and give her a clearer line of sight. Ray noticed all of it without showing that he noticed anything at all. To the crowd, his face remained an unreadable mask of discipline, eyes fixed in ceremonial line, body governed by measured sequence. Inside, his awareness mapped the lane by sectors and patterns, each person and object assigned position, speed, trajectory, and likely intent. That internal geometry had not arrived with Arlington. It had been built in mountain valleys and dust-heavy streets where hesitation carried costs no report could fully describe. At 30, Ray already carried 2 Afghanistan tours and 1 Syria deployment in his bones, along with a Bronze Star with V device that he never mentioned unless duty required paperwork. A thin scar ran along his jaw, pale against winter skin, left by a blast in Kunar that had taken hearing from his left ear for 12 days and left him with a permanent habit of turning slightly toward sound. None of those facts could be seen by the visitors looking at polished boots and bright brass. What they saw was ceremony. What stood in front of them was a man forged by consequence. In Afghanistan, he had learned the language of subtle shifts, a window curtain that moved against wind direction, a parked motorcycle whose engine block was still warm, a street vendor who stopped speaking when a second truck appeared. In Syria, he learned to read crowds and transit points, where fear and urgency could turn a harmless bottleneck into a hazard in seconds. Yet the most enduring wound in him came from one name, one voice, one moment that did not heal with time. Sergeant First Class Michael Mick Carter had been his team leader and closest friend, broad-shouldered, relentless, and incapable of letting silence get too heavy. Under incoming mortar fire during an extraction that should have been routine and turned lethal, Mick had grinned through smoke and shouted, "If we make it home, I'm never running again unless Chow's on fire." It was a ridiculous line at a brutal moment, and that was exactly why Ray remembered it with unbearable clarity. Mick had shoved Ray behind hard cover as debris tore through the alley. Ray lived. Mick did not. The dead do not ask for monuments. The living build them because grief needs somewhere to stand. For Ray, the tomb and the surrounding grounds became that place where memory was not abstract and not optional. He had joined the old guard, not to disappear into ritual, but to preserve a vow in motion. He could not return Mick to his family. He could not restore birthdays, field jokes, or the shape of a laugh in a barracks hallway. He could keep cadence. He could maintain standards that refused erosion. He could stand for the unnamed fallen with perfect discipline because memory was the last promise he could still keep. That vow lived in each turn of his heel, each controlled breath, each measured pause. By the second week of October, the morning crowds had shifted from summer tourism to autumn remembrance, a mix of school groups, veterans' families, and travelers who came expecting a landmark and left carrying a burden they had not anticipated. Ray had worked enough of these details to know that reverence arrived in layers. Some people showed it immediately. Others needed time on the stone path, time among rows of white markers receding over hills like disciplined ranks, time to hear a guide speak one name, one date, one age too young. He gave them that time by holding form. The discipline was not for spectacle. It was a container for the nation's grief, and if the container cracked, the meaning leaked out with it. A young boy near the back tugged his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Does he ever blink?" The mother leaned down, kept her voice low, and answered, "He does. He just doesn't miss." The veteran nurse heard it and nodded once, almost smiling. The Marine in the Purple Heart cap shifted his stance, winced at a knee that had seen another century, and stayed in place anyway. Two teenage girls who had arrived laughing at private jokes straightened and watched in open concentration, as if they were witnessing a language being spoken without words. Emma lifted one gloved hand in a small wave that she did not expect returned and did not need returned. She was there to witness, and she knew witnessing was its own kind of tribute. Ray completed another pass along the designated line and turned with exact economy, not 1 degree too wide. The mist thinned. Sunlight reached the upper edges of marble and set them glowing pale gold. A shuttle driver down the loop checked mirrors and kept the engine in neutral, waiting for foot traffic to clear. A grounds employee adjusted a barrier post by 1/2 an inch and stepped back to evaluate alignment. No one rushed. Even movement that had nothing to do with ceremony borrowed its tempo from the place. Arlington did that. It taught strangers to coordinate with memory. His eyes, dark and steady, remained locked on a point only he could see, though his peripheral awareness continued its constant scan. Shoulder posture in the crowd, hand placement near wheels and rails, distances between strollers and curb edges, unattended bags, rising voices, descending patience. To outsiders, this level of vigilance might have seemed excessive in a cemetery under morning light. To Ray, it was baseline respect. The unknown soldier represented all who never made it home. That demanded attention, not in moments of crisis alone, but in every ordinary minute when complacency tried to pass as peace. A breeze moved through with sharper cold. Coats zipped higher. Breath showed faintly above the nearest cluster of visitors. One tram hissed as its doors folded open for the next group, then closed again when an attendant signaled for a short hold. The day continued in measured increments, each second carrying the weight of routine and the possibility of disruption. Ray absorbed both without altering cadence. The crowd remained hushed, humbled by ritual, while sacred ground held them all inside a discipline older and larger than any single life. Then the profane cut straight across the sacred. A shout cracked over the shuttle loop, bright and careless, the kind of noise that belonged to stadium parking lots and dorm hallways, not this hillside of white stone and folded flags. Trent Holloway vaulted onto the low memorial boundary beside the loading lane, one sneaker on polished granite, designer varsity jacket bright against the muted morning, phone arm extended high as his live stream numbers climbed. He jerked his shoulders into a mocking imitation of cadence and barked into the camera, "Look at this parade prop. Arlington's got actors now." A few classmates laughed because they thought they were background and he was the show. Then he swung his phone in a wide arc to capture himself, clipped the wheelchair handles behind him, and jolted Emma Cole's chair half a turn toward the curb edge. The crowd froze. The father with the stroller stopped mid-step, one wheel hanging over a seam in the pavement. The two high school boys, who had pocketed their phones, pulled them out again but did not lift them, fingers hovering over black screens, as if contact alone might make them useful. The elderly Marine gripped his cane harder, shoulders rising, jaw tightening around words he refused to spend in that place. The veteran nurse moved first, one stride, then checked herself because she was 3 people deep and boxed by a barrier post. Emma's mother caught the right handle and pulled back, but Trent's careless hip had already shifted the chair's angle, toward the shuttle lane where asphalt dipped and sloped. The tram driver hit the brake and leaned on the horn once, short and sharp, as warning rather than panic. Murmurs rippled like wildfire and then died as people understood they were watching disrespect turn into hazard in real time. Trent grinned at the comments flooding his screen, intoxicated by his own reflection in the glass. He called over his shoulder without looking, "Get closer. Get the toy soldier in frame. This is gold." He was a political science honors student from Jefferson State, campus channel host, donor-connected, practiced at harvesting outrage clips and converting human moments into engagement metrics. He had arrived with classmates who expected a field trip and found themselves drafted into his brand. He believed ceremony existed to be punctured, that discipline was costume, that military ritual was theater put on for tourists. He did not know that the man he mocked had pulled civilians out under fire in Kunar, had read alley angles and rooftops through smoke, had tracked threat vectors in refugee choke points in Syria, and had carried a friend's last joke through years like a folded letter against his ribs. Ray did not flinch. Externally, he remained what Arlington asked him to be: posture locked, expression unreadable, uniform immaculate, white gloves still, boots set with machine-perfect geometry, on Arlington grounds. Internally, his awareness accelerated into combat math so quickly it felt like memory more than thought. Child in chair at 15 feet and rolling on slight decline. Mother bracing from right rear with compromised leverage. Tram stopped, but lane still open to secondary shuttle entry. Antagonist elevated on boundary stone, unstable footing, right hand occupied with phone, left arm free to overcorrect and worsen movement. Crowd density increasing behind barrier, escape paths narrowing by the second. He tracked all of it while his eyes appeared fixed in ceremonial line. What no one around Trent could have guessed was that Ray had already seen more than the mockery. On the jacket sleeve, just above the cuff, a stitched Jefferson State crest in navy and silver. On the phone screen, reflected in Trent's own sunglasses, a live stream handle pulsing at the bottom corner. On his own earpiece, the clear channel to Arlington Protective Detail. Without shifting tone, without broadcasting alarm, Ray had spoken one coded phrase 3 breaths earlier as he passed the lane marker, a phrase that sounded to bystanders like routine transit coordination and translated to security as active disrespect with vulnerable civilian at risk. That phrase had already triggered a quiet chain. Local protective response, incident log, institutional contact request, routed through visitor delegation records. Protocol moved fast when this ground was involved. Emma's chair rolled another inch. Trent laughed again, oblivious, still narrating himself. "Watch this, guys. He won't do anything. They're trained not to." Ray's eyes locked on 2 points in the same instant. The angle of Emma's wheel at the curb lip and the geotag pulsing on Trent's stream. One was immediate danger. One was consequence. He held both. For a suspended second, the whole loop seemed to stop breathing. Mist hung over the lane in thin bands. Brass on Ray's chest caught a pale shard of sun and flashed once. The Marine's cane trembled against stone. A child somewhere behind the barrier whispered, "Mom?" and got no answer because every adult in reach had gone silent at once, witnessing the line between ignorance and damage grow thinner by the heartbeat. Before anyone else moved, before Trent understood the geometry he had disturbed, Ray shifted a fraction of weight through his left boot, small as a clock tick, precise as a blade finding center. Before we dive into this story, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe that values like honor, courage, and sacrifice still matter, join us in keeping their legacy alive. The pause sat over the shuttle loop like held breath over water. It did not reduce tension, it sharpened it. In that suspended beat, every figure in the scene carried a different definition of what mattered, and the difference between those definitions was the whole moral geometry of the morning. Trent measured value in views, clips, and the instant reward of strangers typing approval. Ray measured value in duty, consequence, and the unbroken protection of people who came to this ground carrying private grief. The crowd stood between those paradigms, forced to choose in silence which one they would validate by action or inaction. At that hour, Arlington was neither fully ceremonial nor fully logistical. It was both, and that duality demanded a more nuanced discipline than spectators usually recognized. Tour trams arrived on schedules, families navigated ramps and curbs, delegations clustered around guides, and somewhere above all of it, the tomb continued its timeless cadence. The prevailing consensus among those who served there was simple. There were no off zones inside the cemetery perimeter, only different expressions of the same obligation. A sentinel on the mat and a staff sergeant on transit security carried one framework, one chain of accountability, one shared promise to the fallen and to the living who came to honor them. Consequently, when Trent treated the shuttle loop as a stage, he did not merely break decorum, he collided with institutional memory backed by people trained to move consequence faster than ego could process. Ray's composure in that instant was not theatrical calm. It was layered control built from non-trivial trade-offs. If he broke protocol too early, he risked escalating a scene in front of families and children on Arlington grounds. If he delayed action by even a narrow margin, Emma's chair could tip into the lane and transform disrespect into physical harm. If he addressed Trent loudly, he might feed the very spectacle Trent wanted. If he ignored the provocation, he would abandon the vulnerable to protect an abstraction of ceremony rather than its underlying purpose. The crux was clear to him with brutal precision. Protocol existed to preserve dignity and safety, not to paralyze duty when safety was in motion. Across the barrier, witnesses processed that tension through their own histories. The veteran nurse recognized triage logic in Ray's stillness, the decomposition of chaos into priorities. The Marine saw something older, the hard restraint of a serviceman, refusing to let anger make decisions. The father with the stroller shifted his son to his opposite arm, opening space instinctively, no orders required. The two high school boys, uncertain but attentive, stepped backward to clear sightlines. Even Trent's classmates began to peel away from him by inches, faces flushing as laughter curdled into embarrassment. One girl in a college sweatshirt whispered, "Trent, stop." But he kept talking to his camera, convinced volume could overwrite reality. Even now, several of those witnesses are fixing this exact second in memory from different angles, and the shared impression is already forming. Ray looks carved from stone right until the point movement becomes duty. That convergence matters, because accountability on Arlington grounds relies on more than one camera and one loud narrator. It relies on converging testimony, on institutions willing to weigh evidence rather than influence, and on professionals who understand that restraint, properly timed, carries as much force as direct intervention. The hidden variable kept widening beneath Trent's feet. He still believed he was mocking a decorative guard. He had not noticed Ray's coded transmission. He had not noticed the tram driver's hand already on dispatch. He had not noticed the protective detail observer near the map board touching his earpiece and turning toward the lane. He had not noticed that his own stream, geotagged and public, had preserved his words with timestamp and location metadata. He had not noticed that one of his followers had tagged Jefferson State's official account in the chat within seconds of the first taunt. Institutional consequence was no longer theoretical. It was already in transit. A primary consideration in scenes like this was crowd behavior under stress, and Ray had learned in combat and in ceremony alike that crowds took emotional cues from the most disciplined figure in view. Had he shouted first, panic could have propagated through families near the curb. Had he rushed without control, bystanders might have surged and created the very hazard he was trying to prevent. So he held his center, measured distance again, and prepared a controlled breach. One step-off lane, one stabilizing contact, one command line. Nothing wasted, nothing dramatic. Just enough force to restore order and hand the next layer to arriving authority. Emma, small beneath her navy blanket, kept her eyes on him. She did not cry out. She gripped the blanket edge and waited with the strange steadiness of children who have already sat through military ceremonies and learned that calm can be an act of courage. Her mother leaned in, muscles trembling from the awkward angle, and whispered, "I've got you," though the chair's front caster kept edging toward the lip. That whisper reached the nearest witnesses and tightened the silence further. This was no longer about a rude college stunt. It was about whether sacred space would protect the vulnerable in the exact moment protection was needed. The mist continued to thin, revealing more of the white slopes beyond the loop, rows of headstones stretching in disciplined lines like a nation's memory laid out in stone. In another part of the cemetery, a distant command carried on cold air, clipped and formal. Here at the lane, no command had yet been spoken. Ray's jaw set over the pale scar from Kunar. His gloves remained pristine. His shoulders stayed square. The architecture of his training, forged in steel and fire, aligned with the moral center of his post: defend dignity, preserve safety, honor the dead by how the living are treated on their ground. He marked Trent's handle, the crest on the sleeve, the angle of the chair, the spacing of bodies, and the approach route for security in one coherent map. Then he took in a measured breath and let it out slowly, the way he had learned to do when incoming rounds once made the world shrink to fractions of a second. The crowd watched, hushed and transformed from spectators into witnesses. Trent kept filming, unaware that his window for arrogance was closing with mathematical certainty. Ray held his expression in disciplined calm and prepared to move with a precision that would carry both protection and consequence in the same motion. Ray held that calm for one more heartbeat, then another, as if time itself had been ordered to stand at attention. The shuttle loop sat at the edge of ceremony and movement. A crescent of polished curb, granite edging, and painted lane markings that seemed almost out of place against rolling hills of white headstones. Morning mist had lifted just enough to reveal long sight lines through Arlington's terraces, where marble markers marched in geometric rows over the slopes like silent formations. Cold air carried three distinct sounds at once: the low idle of a tram engine waiting under restraint, the far-off crack of rifle cadence from an honors detail on another hill, and the soft rustle of coats as visitors shifted weight without daring to break the hush. Even Trent's stream chatter, tinny through his own phone speaker, sounded vulgar against the disciplined quiet of that ground. At 10:17 that morning, the sun finally found the brass on Ray's chest and lit it like a signal flare. He looked built for impact and trained for stillness, 6'2" beneath the blue-black ceremonial wool, shoulders square, spine upright, chin level. The kepi sat with mathematical precision. The white gloves remained immaculate despite damp stone and shifting wind. His jacket lay flat without a wrinkle. Each crease in his trousers was so exact it seemed drawn in metal, not fabric. The rifle at his shoulder stayed perfectly aligned with his center line, no sway, no drift. His boots, polished to mirror depth, reflected a broken image of curb paint, shoes, and sky. To a casual eye, he was a ceremonial figure. To anyone who understood discipline, he was a containment system for chaos, a professional whose restraint was active, not passive. The crowd registered that fact in fragments. The Purple Heart Marine, cap brim shadowing a face lined by age and service, had gone still except for his left thumb rubbing the edge of the embroidered patch on instinct. The veteran nurse had shifted her stance into balance, one foot subtly forward, body angled toward Emma and her mother, reading risk the way she had once read monitors in triage bays. The father with the stroller had turned his son's body away from the curb, while keeping his own eyes locked on the lane. Protective reflex overriding confusion. Two high school boys in team hoodies stood shoulder to shoulder, phones down at their sides now, no longer recording, just watching with the quiet seriousness of young men seeing duty up close for the first time. Emma's mother had both hands braced on the wheelchair grips, wrists taut, jaw set, while Emma sat small and straight beneath her navy blanket. Gold star pinned bright on her coat like a single hard point of truth. Ray's eyes never betrayed urgency, yet his internal map kept updating. Wheel angle, unstable near the curb lip. Grade of slope, slight but sufficient. Crowd drift, inward pressure from rear observers. Actor on boundary stone. Elevated, unbalanced, attention consumed by self-display. Secondary hazard, open lane behind tram nose. He did not need to move yet to dominate the geometry. He needed everyone else to freeze in the right places for half a second longer. Trent, still elevated on the low memorial boundary, mistook that half second for victory. His designer varsity jacket, with its stitched Jefferson State crest at the sleeve, flashed in and out of the phone frame as he pivoted for angles. He smiled at his own reflection, then at the comments, then at the crowd he believed he controlled, and he kept talking in that clipped, performative cadence of a student who had learned that contempt generated engagement. One classmate, face drained of color, whispered, "Trent, get down." Another took 2 steps back and lowered her eyes. None of it reached him. He had reduced the place to content, and the people in it to props, and he did not yet understand that Arlington did not negotiate with that world view. The lane lights on the waiting tram blinked amber against gray stone. Near the map board, a plainclothes protective observer, outwardly just another staffer in a windbreaker, touched his earpiece and scanned for clear approach, while the shuttle driver held brake pressure and watched mirrors for a safe corridor. Procedure was converging from multiple directions, quiet and exact, because professionals in that environment did not rush into disorder. They closed on it with layers. Ray knew those layers, trusted them, and still kept the central burden on himself. In the immediate 10 feet around Emma's chair, he was the only one with both angle and authority to intervene without multiplying risk. His breathing stayed slow. His pulse did not. What the crowd saw was marble composure. What stood inside that composure was a combat veteran, running nonverbal equations at speed, a man who had spent years learning that there was a narrow threshold between restraint and negligence, and that honor required knowing precisely where that threshold lay. Every instinct in him coiled for movement. Every discipline in him insisted movement would come only when it could be clean. Memory came in brief, bright shards, Kunar dust in his teeth, Assyria corridor collapsing into smoke, the metallic taste that followed the blast that carved the line on his jaw. Bronze Star paperwork had called it valor. Ray remembered only Mick's hand dragging him clear and the words shouted through debris. "If we make it home, I'm never running again unless Chow is on fire." Mick had not made it home. Ray's vow had. Trent swung his phone again, arm wide for effect, and the motion sent his balance forward on the stone edge. His sneakers skidded a fraction on damp granite. He recovered with a laugh that came out too loud, then shoved his chin toward Ray and played to the stream as if near falls were part of the show. He kept talking over comments he did not read carefully, eyes darting to hearts and viewer count, while ignoring the warning signs that everyone else could feel in their bones. Emma's chair remained angled wrong. Her mother's shoulders tightened as she tried to drag the rear wheels back a few inches without tipping her daughter toward the lane. The chair resisted at the caster. The shuttle driver gave a short warning horn, one restrained burst, not panic, just signal, then kept his foot hard on the brake, and his radio clipped near his collarbone live for dispatch. He did not advance. He did not look away. His left hand stayed ready at the door control in case protective personnel needed fast boarding clearance or lane hold extension, and his eyes tracked the same triangle Ray tracked. Trent's footing, Emma's front wheel, the narrowing space at the curb. By the map board, the protective observer pivoted half a step, palm near his coat seam, voice low into his mic. He did not crowd the scene, did not flare authority, did not contaminate witness lines. He simply fed updates into the chain Ray had already triggered with the coded phrase. The geotagged stream handle, the Jefferson State crest, the face, the conduct, the location, all of it was now moving through channels that were procedural, documented, and difficult for influence to erase. Somewhere beyond the terraces, phones were ringing in offices where titles mattered. At curb level, none of that changed the immediate math. The veteran nurse tried to move, found the barrier of bodies and stroller wheels, and checked herself before she created a second collision path. She raised one hand instead, open palm toward Emma's mother, mouthing a slow instruction to hold the chair straight and keep weight centered. The father with the stroller caught that cue, shifted 2 feet to his right, and carved a narrow lane between himself and the nearest cluster of visitors. The high school students read the same intent and stepped back in sequence, widening the sightline. What had been a crowd was becoming, under pressure, an improvised support perimeter. The elderly Marine in the purple heart cap exhaled once through his nose and planted his cane tip firmly against the stone, as though anchoring himself to restraint. He did not speak. His eyes stayed on Ray with the recognition of one professional watching another at the edge of necessary action. Around him, murmurs died out. Even Trent's classmates, who had arrived hungry for spectacle, looked suddenly like witnesses in a courtroom where they realized the evidence was live and irreversible. Ray marked each microshift. Rear wheel locked by mother's grip. Front caster still turned toward the drop. Child posture upright but vulnerable to abrupt jerk. Antagonist elevated and distracted. Tram static. Lane clear enough for one direct step and one stabilizing contact. He adjusted his center of gravity by millimeters, testing traction on damp stone through polished soles, recalibrating for wool tension at the knee and rifle position at shoulder so nothing snagged or swung. Training did not reduce urgency. It converted urgency into sequence. Trent mistook the silence for fear and leaned further into his own frame. "Look at him," he said to the camera, voice sharpened by adrenaline. "Parade prop won't even blink." He grinned at the flood of reactions and cocked his phone toward Emma's chair as if the near miss were a punchline. One of the high school boys flinched and took another involuntary step back. Emma's mother snapped, "Enough!" the word low and fierce, never taking her hands off the grips. Ray heard all of it and prioritized none of it over the wheel. The coded escalation already in motion widened beyond Arlington's lanes. Protective detail had the metadata. Dispatch had timestamps. Public geotag preserved location integrity. Institutional contact points were now tied to conduct that was no longer deniable because the stream itself had become chain of custody material. Trent still believed he was untouchable in the moment. Ray, without moving his face, understood that the moment was already touching everything beyond it. A gust moved through the loop and lifted the corner of Emma's blanket. The front caster nudged against the curb lip and trembled there, one uneven vibration from rolling free of control. Emma looked up, not crying, just trying to read the adults around her. Her gold star pin caught the light again. And for an instant, Ray saw two timelines superimposed. A child at a curb and a folded flag in a mother's hands years earlier. The vow was not abstract. It was this distance, this angle, this second. Now, in this suspended moment at the shuttle loop, mist and marble and witnesses and protocol compressed into a single decision space. Ray's posture remained formal, shoulders level, gloves bright, expression unreadable. Inside, he carried Mick's grin like a command and Arlington's weight like an oath. He shifted his focus one final time from Trent's elevated stance to Emma's front caster and fixed the exact point where his boot edge would stop the wheel without jolt. His right hand eased a fraction, ready to stabilize the chair frame. His left remained disciplined at his side. No wasted motion, no spectacle, just duty, distilled. Then he moved. His first step came off the ceremonial axis like a controlled detonation. Not rushed, not wild, a single measured displacement of weight and leather on damp stone. Precise enough that the toe of his right boot found purchase, where polished curb met textured pavement. And suddenly everyone at the shuttle loop understood they were no longer watching routine. They were watching judgment in motion. Trent's grin faltered for half a second. Then came back harder because he mistook discipline for hesitation and movement for permission. "That's it," Trent said into his phone, angling the lens up toward Ray as if framing a challenge. "Toy soldier, broke character." He had built a reputation on that tone. On campus, Trent Holloway was the honors student who understood algorithms better than empathy. The political science debater who could cite constitutional language in class and then reduce real people to bait online by noon. He hosted a student channel that lived on controversy clips. Administrators had tolerated him because he drew attention. Donor families knew his name because he kept their causes trending. He called it accountability media. Faculty who had watched the pattern called it performance predation and kept those thoughts private, because his father chaired a development committee that could make a dean's week harder with one phone call. In his own circle, he wore confidence like armor plated with branding. The designer varsity jacket was not just clothing, it was signal. Jefferson State crest on the sleeve, expensive stitching on the collar, a look calibrated to say old money wrapped in youth culture. He arrived at Arlington with 3 classmates he treated as camera crew without asking, and 2 more who followed because saying no to Trent usually meant becoming content yourself. They had started the morning with forced jokes on the bus. By the time they reached the shuttle loop, only Trent was still laughing. The fatal flaw in him was not simply arrogance. It was a framework. He believed institutions were mostly stage sets, and that rules bent for whoever understood leverage. Ceremony, to him, was theater for people who needed myths. A guard was costume. A veteran was optics. A sacred place was a backdrop with good lighting. Consequently, when he saw Ray in transit detail rather than on the mat, he made his calculation in seconds. Lower stakes, less scrutiny, better clip. He never asked what happened when he was wrong. Ray took a second step, shoulders square, eyes locked, not on Trent's face, but on the chair's front caster, trembling against the curb lip. Externally, his expression remained carved from stone. Internally, he was running distances to the inch. 3 feet to Emma's right wheel, 2.5 to Trent's unstable stance, 4 to the nearest bystander who might surge at the wrong moment. He heard the tram engine, the weak hiss of brakes, Emma's mother pulling breath through clenched teeth, and above all of it, Trent narrating his own downfall. "Get this, guys," Trent called to his stream. "He thinks this is sacred because he has a shiny badge." One classmate finally found her voice. "Trent, stop filming her. Stop." He ignored her, panning the camera toward Emma's chair as if proximity were entitlement. The chat on his screen moved too fast to read, but a few comments caught and flashed long enough for nearby witnesses to see words like "out of line" and "wrong place." That only made him louder. He had spent years in digital rooms where volume replaced accountability and where deleting a post felt like erasing cause. Here, with geotag pinned to Arlington and faces in full daylight, deletion would not outrun evidence. By 10:18 a.m., Protective Dispatch had repeated his handle twice over secure channel and flagged the university delegation file. Ray already knew that because he had heard the faint click confirm in his earpiece after the coded phrase. He also knew exactly what that meant inside Arlington's operating framework. Record locked, witness pool expanding, institutional contacts moving. He did not need to look at Trent's sleeve again to remember the crest. Jefferson State. Delegation bus at Lower Loop. Faculty chaperone listed in intake. Administrative escalation protocol active. Trent still thought this was a game of who could go viral first. Ray understood it had become a matter of documented conduct on federal sacred ground. Emma's chair shifted another fraction. Her mother pulled back, rear wheels resisting because one brake was half engaged from the earlier jolt. The veteran nurse moved as far as she could without colliding with the stroller and spoke in a calm clinical tone that cut through the tension. "Keep her straight. Don't yank. Just hold." Emma nodded once, small and steady, as if she had practiced stillness in rooms where adults delivered hard news. Her gold star pin glinted against navy fabric. Trent swung his phone past her again, and the Marine in the Purple Heart cap stepped forward until his cane hit the painted line and stopped there, old discipline holding him in place by force of will. "Son," the Marine said, voice low, "step down." Trent gave him a dismissive glance and laughed into the camera. "Everybody's so dramatic." That line settled over the crowd like an insult delivered at a graveside. The 2 high school boys, who had been uncertain a minute earlier, now stood with jaws tight, phones lowered to their thighs, not recording, just witnessing. The father with the stroller positioned his body between his child and the lane and stared at Trent with quiet disbelief. A pair of tourists near the mapboard whispered to each other, not in gossip, but in the clipped cadence of people memorizing details for statements later. Ray closed another foot of distance and stopped exactly where he needed to stop, still not touching the chair, still not speaking. His restraint had a purpose beyond composure. He was giving Trent one final interval to self-correct, under public warning from peers and elders. In military terms, it was controlled de-escalation. In moral terms, it was mercy offered before consequence. Trent used it to grandstand. Look at him, he said, thrusting the phone closer toward Ray's chest insignia. Parade boy finally woke up. The words were contemptuous. The hand holding the phone shook just enough to betray adrenaline. He was no longer in pure performance mode. He was reacting to a force he did not understand, a silence that did not retreat and would not entertain him. Ray's gaze remained level, unreadable, and Trent kept filling the quiet because silence from a disciplined man can feel like a verdict before the sentence is spoken. Inside Ray, every instinct was coiled to move through contact sequence. Boot edge to caster, left glove to frame, right hand ready to stabilize shoulder line. If the chair jolted, torso angled to shield child from lane. Combat training and ceremonial training were converging into the same non-trivial task. Use minimum force to secure maximum safety while preserving dignity for everyone present. His pulse thudded once, hard, then settled into operational calm. He remembered Mick Carter in a corridor lit by dust and muzzle flashes, joking when fear could have swallowed the team whole. He remembered the shove that saved his life and the silence after. That memory did not make him reckless. It made him exact. The vow he carried had never been about anger. It was about refusing to fail people who trusted uniform protection without needing to ask for it. Trent shifted his footing on the boundary stone and called over his shoulder at his classmates. Get closer. This is the clip. No one moved. One of the girls, face pale, took out her own phone and started recording from a stable angle, not for social media, but for evidence. Another stepped to Emma's mother and asked quietly, "Do you want me to hold her bag?" The mother nodded without taking her eyes off the front wheel. The veteran nurse finally reached the open lane the father had created and stood ready at Emma's left side, hands visible, waiting for Ray's cue. The crowd had transformed. Minutes earlier, they had been visitors passing through an itinerary stop. Now they functioned as a civilian perimeter around a child and a standard. That shift did not happen by chance. It happened because one disciplined figure refused panic and forced everyone else to choose whether they would align with dignity or spectacle. A faint siren tone sounded from farther down the service road, then cut. Not dramatic, just present. The kind of official approach signal that tells professional support is inside the grid. Trent heard it and glanced down the lane for the first time, calculation flickering across his face. He immediately recovered with a smirk for the camera. But the mask had cracked. He was beginning to register that this scene no longer belonged to him. "What? You call backup?" he said toward Ray, trying for mockery and landing on strain. Ray did not answer. He shifted half a step, placing his body between Trent's phone arc and Emma's chair. And the move was so clean, it looked like choreography designed by principle rather than ego. White glove near the chair's frame. Boot angled at the caster. Shoulders squared to both threat and child. He had now occupied the decisive geometry. Every unsafe line ran through him first. The tram driver cracked his door 2 inches and called out, "Lane locked. Nobody moves forward." His voice carried authority born of routine emergencies handled without drama. A protective detail officer in plain clothes arrived at the outer edge of the crowd, identified himself to 2 witnesses, and stayed there, allowing Ray to finish the immediate stabilization without interference. Procedure layered in exactly as designed. Trent stared at Ray's face, searching for anger he could exploit and finding none. That unnerved him more than shouting would have. He lifted his phone one more time as if volume could restore control. Ray spoke at last, voice calm, formal, and edged like steel drawn from a scabbard. "Lower the device. Step off the memorial boundary." No raised tone, no threat, Just command language with institutional weight behind it. The words landed across the shuttle loop and silenced stray whispers. Trent did not obey. He hesitated, eyes flicking between Ray, the crowd, and his own screen, trapped between persona and consequence. Seconds stretched. Cold air tightened in everyone's lungs. Emma watched Ray with complete trust. She had not offered any other adult in that moment. The Marine's cane stayed planted. The nurse kept one hand ready. The father held his stroller still as stone. Even the leaves at the edge of the lane seemed to stop moving. Ray held position, motionless again on the surface, every muscle ready beneath wool and brass, a sentinel at the seam between sacred order and careless harm. He waited exactly long enough for the command to be heard by Trent, by witnesses, by arriving authority, and by history itself in that place where memory was never abstract. Then Trent laughed weakly and raised the phone higher. Ray moved. It was one controlled breach, nothing more, and it split the moment cleanly in two. His right boot edged forward and caught the wheelchair's front caster before gravity could claim it. His left gloved hand settled on the chair frame just below Emma's armrest, firm enough to stop motion, gentle enough that the chair did not jolt. Wool, brass, leather, and discipline aligned in a single, precise action that looked less like improvisation than a drill practiced for years in silence. The wheel stopped at the curb lip. A collective gasp broke from the crowd, sharp and involuntary. The father with the stroller shut his eyes for one beat and opened them again. The Marine's cane struck stone once as his grip loosened from strain. The veteran nurse exhaled through her nose and kept her hand poised, now no longer needed. Emma's mother bowed her head for a fraction of a second, relief hitting harder than fear had. Ray turned his head to Trent. His expression did not change. No anger, no theater, only command. Stand down. This ground is not your stage. The words landed with the weight of finality. Trent froze where he stood, one sneaker on the boundary stone, one hand up with the phone, his mouth still half open around whatever line he had planned next. He had expected argument, maybe shouting, maybe the kind of confrontation he could cut into clips and captions. He got none of that. He got a calm directive, delivered in a tone that carried institutional force, and the force of it stripped performance out of him. The livestream chat kept flying up his screen while he stood motionless, suddenly irrelevant to his own feed. Ray remained anchored at Emma's chair, boot still bracing the caster, glove still steadying the frame. Inside, his pulse hammered once, then steadied into measured rhythm. Protocol had been breached by inches, and intent, exactly as required. Minimum intervention, maximum protection, no excess. He did not look toward the crowd for approval. He did not look toward Trent for reaction. His focus stayed on safety geometry and lane control, the invisible architecture of duty that made sacred ground function when ego tried to fracture it. "Mom," Emma whispered. Her mother's voice shook but held. "You're okay, baby. You're okay?" Trent swallowed. "You can't touch me over this," he said, but the line came out thin, detached from his earlier swagger. Ray did not answer him. He did not need to. At 10:19 a.m., the first Arlington security officer reached the outer arc of the crowd at a controlled run, followed by a second who moved directly to lane closure and hand-signaled the tram driver to maintain a hard stop. The plainclothes protective observer stepped in beside Trent's flank and spoke without raising his voice. "Mr. Holloway, device down. Stream ends now. Preserve position." For half a second, Trent looked ready to argue, eyes flicking toward his comments as if a scrolling audience could still lend him spine. Then he saw who had arrived behind the first two officers. A full colonel in service dress, ribbons aligned, face set in the hard neutrality of command that had no interest in negotiation. Colonel Nathan Whitaker crossed the painted line and stopped 3 paces from Ray, taking in the stopped wheel, the child, the boundary stone, the raised phone, and the witnesses in one sweep. "Report," he said. Ray kept one hand on the chair, eyes front. "Sir, civilian subject mounted memorial boundary, made repeated verbal mockery, physically impacted wheelchair handles, displaced minor toward active shuttle lane. I initiated protective exception to stabilize chair and issued stand-down command. No further force." Whitaker gave one short nod. "Action was correct." The words carried outward through the crowd like a bell tone. Shoulders lowered. Murmurs started and stopped. A high school boy whispered, "He was right," and his friend answered, "Yeah," as if he had just learned something bigger than the incident in front of him. The second security officer addressed Trent directly. "Step off the boundary. Slowly." Trent stepped down. "Phone at your side." He obeyed, this time without commentary. The officer held out a small evidence pouch and a department-issued capture unit. "Livestream is now flagged as incident media. You will end broadcast in view of witnesses. We already have archival capture from the live feed and dispatch log." That landed harder than any rebuke. Trent stared at the pouch, then at his phone, as if realizing for the first time that deletion and disappearance were not the same thing. He tapped the screen with an unsteady thumb. The stream ended. Behind him, one of his classmates covered her mouth and turned away. Another straightened, stepped toward Emma's mother and said, "I'm sorry. I should have stopped him sooner." Emma's mother gave a tight nod, too focused on her daughter to answer more. The shuttle driver leaned out through the half-open door, handset lifted. "Colonel, Arlington Dispatch patched the university line. Dean Margaret Voss is on and requests speaker with subject present." Whitaker extended his hand. "Put it through." The driver toggled speaker mode. A crisp female voice cut into the cold air, amplified by the bus cabin, and carried across stone. "This is Dean Margaret Voss, Jefferson State University. Is Mr. Trent Holloway present and able to hear me?" Trent stared at the bus door like it had opened into a courtroom. "Yes, ma'am." "Mr. Holloway, effective immediately. You are suspended from Jefferson State pending formal conduct review. You are removed from this university delegation as of this moment. You are directed to surrender your student ID to the accompanying faculty, chaperone, upon return." No one moved. Even the wind seemed to hold. Dean Voss continued, voice level and precise. "You are further ordered to issue a public written and recorded apology to the Cole family and to recognize veterans organizations identified by our office. That apology will acknowledge your conduct at Arlington National Cemetery and your role in endangering a minor visitor." Trent's face had gone pale. "Ma'am, She cut him off. "You will listen. Incident footage, including your own live stream, has been preserved and forwarded to conduct authorities. Any attempt to alter or suppress material will be treated as an aggravating violation. Do you understand?" He swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am." "Say it clearly." "Yes, ma'am. I understand." "Then begin by apologizing now to the child and her family. On speaker." Whitaker turned his head slightly toward Trent, but said nothing. He did not need to. Command and consequence were already aligned. Trent faced Emma and her mother. For the first time that morning, his voice was stripped of performance. "Emma, Mrs. Cole, I'm sorry. I was disrespectful, and I put you at risk. I was wrong." Emma looked at him for a long second, then at Ray's gloved hand steady on her chair. "Okay," she said quietly, not forgiving him so much as ending his access to her fear. Mrs. Cole held Trent's gaze. "You apologize with actions now." "Yes, ma'am," he said. Dean Voss spoke again. "Mr. Holloway, you will travel separately from the delegation under supervision. You will not post, stream, or comment publicly until directed by Conduct Council. Colonel Whitaker, Arlington Security, thank you for your professionalism. Staff Sergeant Kim's intervention protected a child and reflected standards we should have honored from the start." Whitaker answered, "Acknowledged, Dean Voss." The line clicked off. For a beat, the only sounds were idling engine hum and distant cadence from another hill. Then the crowd reacted in a low wave, not cheering, not celebratory, but relieved and chastened. A tourist murmured, "Good," under his breath. The Marine in the Purple Heart cap lifted 2 fingers toward Ray in a small salute from where he stood. The veteran nurse touched Emma's shoulder and asked softly, "You steady, sweetheart?" Emma nodded. Security completed the procedural close with practiced economy. The capture officer logged Trent's handle, timestamp, and geotag reference aloud for witness confirmation. A second officer photographed shoe scuffs on the memorial boundary and the curb position where the chair had been intercepted, then marked both in the incident app. Trent's phone was returned after verification that the live session had been terminated, and mirrored evidence receipt had posted to dispatch. No loose ends, no ambiguous chain. Whitaker stepped closer to Ray and spoke low enough to preserve dignity, loud enough for the nearest witnesses to hear what mattered. "Staff Sergeant Kim, resume standard posture when the chair is secured. Your judgment held the line." "Yes, sir." Ray gave one measured nod, then looked to Emma's mother. "Ma'am, on your count. I'll release with you." She adjusted her grip, set the rear wheel brake correctly this time, and said, "Ready." Ray lifted his glove from the frame and eased his boot clear of the caster in the same smooth sequence he had used to stop it. The chair remained stable, safely back from the lip. Emma let out a breath she had been holding and smoothed her blanket with both hands. Trent stood under security observation, phone dark at his side, jacket crest suddenly looking less like status and more like evidence. The classmates who had once orbited his confidence now stood apart, eyes lowered, each one silently calculating the cost of mistaking spectacle for strength. Whitaker turned to the assembled visitors. "Area is secure. Keep the lane clear and continue respectfully." People obeyed at once. The father repositioned his stroller and whispered to his son, "Remember this." The high school boys tucked their phones away again, this time with deliberation. The nurse and Marine exchanged a brief glance of shared understanding that needed no words. Arlington's hush returned, not as passive quiet, but as order restored by duty, witness, and consequence, delivered in full view of the nation, in miniature, gathered there that morning. Arlington's hush returned, not as silence imposed by fear, but as silence chosen after truth had been spoken aloud. Ray stepped back into formal bearing beside Emma's chair, shoulders squared, chin level, white gloves still bright against dark wool. Colonel Whitaker gave a brief hand signal, and procedure moved forward in clean lines. The capture officer sealed the evidence pouch, read the incident number for witness confirmation, and repeated each item into his recorder. Archive livestream file, timestamp log, geotag capture, boundary scuff photographs, and dispatch mirror receipt tied to Trent's device, ID. The plainclothes observer from the map board approached with a tablet already open and presented it to Whitaker. "Protective detail packet complete, sir. University liaison acknowledged transfer. Delegation chaperone is en route to receive student status action. Whitaker scanned, signed with one deliberate stroke, and handed the tablet back. No flourish, no delay. On this ground, accountability was paperwork as much as posture, and both had to be exact. Trent stood under supervision, jacket crest visible, face drained of color. One officer instructed him to unlock his phone again, this time for evidence verification only. He complied. The capture officer compared the termination screen to dispatch records, confirmed stream closure, then returned the device and announced, "Personal property released. Media evidence preserved under case file." Trent gave a stiff nod. The sentence that mattered most was simple. What he had tried to make temporary was now permanent in record. 3 minutes later, a woman in a charcoal coat and university lanyard arrived at the shuttle loop at a brisk walk, breath visible in the cold. Professor Eleanor Price, Jefferson State Delegation chaperone, identified herself to security, produced credential, and faced Trent without raising her voice. "Student ID," he handed it over. "Bus privileges revoked," she said. "You travel separately under university directive. I will notify your parents from the lower office line." Her tone held neither cruelty nor softness, only institutional finality. She turned to Whitaker. "Colonel, the university accepts full cooperation terms." Whitaker replied, "Your dean's instructions were clear. Ensure the written apology draft is transmitted to our liaison before end of day. Veterans groups copied as directed." Professor Price nodded once. "It will be done." That closed the external contact thread in the open, witnessed by officers, civilians, and the same classmates who had laughed minutes earlier. The classmates stepped forward one by one for statements. The girl who had whispered, "Stop," spoke first, voice unsteady but audible. "I told him twice to get down. He ignored me. I should have stepped in sooner." The officer documented her words and asked if she would submit her recorded angle. She passed over her phone, watched the secure upload complete, and received confirmation of transfer before the device was returned. The classmate who had apologized to Mrs. Cole gave her own account, then asked quietly if she could include a written statement to the dean supporting disciplinary action. "Yes," the officer said. "Attached to case reference." The loaded looks from earlier found their meaning in plain language and signed names. At the curb, the veteran nurse crouched beside Emma's chair and checked the rear brake with practiced hands. "Both locked now," she said to Mrs. Cole, then looked up at Ray. "Staff Sergeant, good intervention." Ray answered with the smallest nod, formal but grateful. Nearby, the Marine with the purple heart cap shifted his cane, stepped as close as the painted line allowed, and addressed Whitaker. "Colonel, if you need witness statement from a retired gunnery sergeant, I'm available." Whitaker met his gaze and said, "We do." The old Marine gave his name, unit, and contact information from memory without hesitation. By 10:31, the lane was fully reset. One officer removed temporary cones. Another confirmed tram route reopened with dispatch. The shuttle driver logged the horn warning and lane hold in his daily sheet, then handed a duplicate slip to security for attachment. Even the strange little details had their place now. The half-engaged brake was noted as corrected, the geotag cataloged, the crest identified in report language as corroborating delegation affiliation. Nothing drifted loose. Whitaker turned to Ray. "Staff Sergeant Kim, transit detail complete. Return to tomb rotation." "Yes, sir." Ray pivoted with mechanical precision, then paused when he heard a small voice at his right side. "Staff Sergeant?" He looked down just enough to acknowledge without breaking bearing. Emma held the edge of her navy blanket in both hands, gold star pin bright against her coat. Up close, she seemed smaller than she had in the lane. but her eyes were steady. "My dad was Army, too," she whispered. A brief shadow crossed Ray's face, there and gone, visible only if you knew what grief looked like when it refused to become spectacle. He lowered his head by a fraction, the nearest thing to a bow he could offer in uniform and on duty. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "I know." Emma absorbed that answer as if it were something solid she could keep. Mrs. Cole placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder and mouthed thank you. No drama, no tears, just the exhausted dignity of a mother who had seen danger arrive and pass in one breath. Ray stepped back into lane, resumed formal movement, and escorted them the final yards to the shuttle boarding point. He did not touch the chair again. He did not need to. The veteran nurse walked on the left side. Professor Price stood back with Trent under officer watch, and the father with the stroller kept the pathway clear. The crowd parted with a respect that had sharpened into understanding. As Emma boarded, she looked over her shoulder once more and raised 2 fingers to her brow in a child's imperfect salute. Ray returned one crisp nod. The shuttle door folded shut with a soft pneumatic sigh, and the vehicle pulled away at idle speed, carrying mother and daughter uphill toward quieter ground. 10 minutes later, Ray crossed back into the ceremonial corridor near the tomb. The mist had lifted fully now. Light lay clean on marble, and the white headstones rolled over the hills in endless, disciplined rows. A flag moved on the ridgeline in the steady autumn wind, snapping once, then stretching wide. Visitors had reformed along the designated viewing area, but they stood differently than before. Phones lowered, shoulders squared, voices subdued. The 2 high school boys were still there, no longer restless, reading each engraved word on the nearest marker, as if the act itself were instruction. The Marine remained at attention with his cane grounded like a staff. The nurse stood with hands folded, eyes forward. Ray took his position. His boots clicked in perfect rhythm. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. Each movement carried the same controlled geometry as always, yet everyone who had witnessed the shuttle loop now understood the deeper architecture beneath it. This was not pageantry. This was disciplined guardianship extending from Marble Plaza to Curb Edge to a 9-year-old child and back again without losing form. Earned honor had met purchased status and did what it always does on sacred ground. It held. At 10:49, a junior security sergeant approached Whitaker at the perimeter and delivered the final administrative callback. "Sir, Jefferson State Dean's office transmitted written confirmation, suspension executed, delegation removal complete, conduct board docketed, apology directives logged with compliance deadline. Digital packet attached to case." Whitaker nodded. "File it," the sergeant replied. "Already filed, sir." External contact resolved. Record closed. Trent departed not on the delegation bus, but in a separate university transport with Professor Price and a campus compliance officer who had arrived from the lower gate. He did not speak as he left. He carried his phone, no ID and no audience. The classmates stayed behind under revised itinerary and listened to a cemetery guide in total silence. One of them, the girl who had recorded evidence, stood with her hands clasped and watched Ray's cadence until the guide began, as if making a private pledge she did not need to announce. On the plaza, the father lifted his son again. This time, the child did not ask whether the guard ever blinked. He asked, "Is he protecting them?" The father answered, "Yes, and us too." The boy nodded, eyes fixed on the measured turn at the end of the walk. Ray completed another pass, face an unreadable mask of discipline, eyes locked on a point only he could see. Inside, memory moved with him. Kunar dust, Syria heat, Mick Carter's grin in the middle of fire, Emma's whisper by the curb. None of it broke cadence, it strengthened it. The vow remained what it had always been. Hold the line between the living and the fallen with precision, humility, and unflinching care. The wind carried a distant rifle report from another honors detail. The sound rolled over, stone, and faded. Ray reached the 21st step, paused, turned, and began again. Boots on marble, rows of white headstones, flag above the hill, sacred ground restored, not by noise but by duty kept exactly.